Hey, let's compare the all-new 15-inch MacBook Air against the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Welcome everybody, welcome to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here, and Apple has just released the all-new 15-inch MacBook Air. I got to check this out ahead of release, but now I have it in the studio, and I am very excited. In this video, I'm going to be comparing this, the new Air, against Apple's existing 14-inch MacBook Pro. I know there's a disparity in price here, but trust me, I think these two are definitely worthy of a comparison. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Let's start off with some basic specs between these two machines. The displays are the first and foremost thing that I want to talk about, and Apple is using a 15.3-inch display on the new MacBook Air versus a 14.2-inch display on the MacBook Pro. Apple calls it a Liquid Retina display versus a Liquid Retina XDR display, where the XDR stands for Extreme Dynamic Range. If we're looking at a standard dynamic range, both of these have a sustained brightness of 500 nits, but when you're looking at HDR content, the new MacBook Pros can get up to 1000 nits sustained or 1600 nits for peak brightness during things like HDR content playback, like you're watching a fight scene in John Wick and there's like a flash that comes across the screen. Yeah, that's super bright, and that's going to be what the dynamic range, or the extreme dynamic range, is all about. On the other hand, the 14-inch MacBook Pro also offers Pro Motion, which is what makes everything look so super smooth when you're scrolling and moving. It's just a higher refresh rate compared to the regular display and the 60 Hz refresh rate on the 15-inch MacBook Air. The MacBook Air's display measures 2880 by 1864, whereas the 14-inch MacBook Pro comes in at 3024 by 1964. If you want to do the math for pixel density, the MacBook Air has 224 pixels per inch, whereas the MacBook Pro has 254 ppi. So not only does the MacBook Pro have a higher density display, it has an XDR display with all that high dynamic range and more brightness, and you have Pro Motion, though it is more than an inch smaller compared to the Air. The MacBook Pro has Wi-Fi 6E, whereas the MacBook Air only has Wi-Fi 6. Both laptops have a 6-speaker array that also supports Dolby Atmos, and they each have 3 microphones, though the MacBook Pro has these perforations on the left and the right side of the keyboard, allowing for audio to come through there versus coming out of the back of the machine. It's a little bit of a toss-up though when I was listening to music. I do think it sounds better on the MacBook Pros, but the MacBook Air has enough space there that it doesn't sound as cramped as it does on the 13-inch MacBook Air. So I think the new 15-inch MacBook Air is a good balance when it comes to audio, kind of splitting the difference between the 13-inch Air and the 14-inch MacBook Pro. They each offer 18 hours of battery life and have a 1080p FaceTime camera. One of the big differences between the two machines is going to come to the port selection. Apple only has a few ports on the 15-inch MacBook Air. You have your MagSafe 3 port there on the left-hand side and 2 Thunderbolt ports. On the right-hand side, you have a single headphone jack, 3.5mm headphone jack. On the 14-inch MacBook Pro, though, you have much more to go with. So on the left-hand side, you still have MagSafe 3, as well as 2 Thunderbolt ports and a headphone jack. But on the right-hand side, you also have the full-size SDXC card reader, an additional Thunderbolt port, and an HDMI output. Let's look at the size and portability of these two machines. The new MacBook Air comes in at 3.3 pounds, and on paper, 3.5 pounds for the new 14-inch MacBook Pro doesn't seem all that much, yet when you're toting it around campus or to work, every single ounce seems to make a difference. That gets compounded when you look at power adapters, whereas the new MacBook Pro, or the new MacBook Air rather, comes with a tiny little 35-watt power adapter. The MacBook Pro can come to a 70-watt power adapter, which is substantially heavier and larger. Just something else that you have to throw into your bag that is adding additional weight. And kind of holding these two machines, it's almost like an optical illusion for your hands. Because the new MacBook Air is so wide and thin, it feels kind of lighter. They weigh nearly the same amount, but when you're holding their hand, the MacBook Pro feels more dense because it's more compact and taller. It just feels like it's heavier. I mean, it is heavier, but it feels more heavier than what it really is. Honestly, the form factor on the 15-inch MacBook Air is absolutely amazing. It's incredible. It just feels ridiculously thin, especially when you open it up and you're using it, because that base gets even thinner. I mean, I thought this looked great on the 13-inch MacBook Air. I think it looks even better here on the 15-inch MacBook Air. It's just an incredibly svelte, light, thin machine. I'm thoroughly impressed with the form factor of the 15-inch MacBook Air. But what about the internals? Hey, I gotta interject for just a moment to thank our sponsor for this video, MacPaw and Clean My Mac X. It's time to keep an eye on your Mac's health. Junk files, malicious apps, and hung processes can slow down even the latest and most powerful Macs. Maintaining your Apple machine's health, whether old or new, is essential to smooth macOS performance. Clean My Mac X is an all-in-one Mac maintenance tool that takes care of old junk, faulty apps, and malware in an efficient, aesthetically pleasing, and hassle-free way. Using the apps menu, you can monitor your Mac's health, CPU load, and more. With nearly 30 million downloads and 15 years of expertise, this app is a must-try for any Mac user. Run Clean My Mac X to gear up your Mac for the groundbreaking additions Apple has announced at this year's WWDC. As Apple continues to pack Macs with innovative new features, Clean My Mac X is here to ensure that your hardware is running at peak performance so that you can enjoy a seamless macOS experience. Exclusive to AppleInsider watchers, you can grab a 5% discount for Clean My Mac X down below in the description. Now, let's get back to that other coverage. But what about the internals? The 15-inch MacBook Air can only be customized with an M2 chip on the inside. Not the M3 that's still yet to be released, and not the M2 Pro, M2 Max, or M2 Ultra. You just have the option for the basic M2. Though Apple does give you a few upgrades with the entry-level version. For example, it still comes with an 8-core CPU, but it immediately gets upgraded to the 10-core GPU instead of the 8-core that the 13-inch starts off with. The 14-inch MacBook Pro comes, of course, with an M2 Pro on the inside, with the option to upgrade to an M2 Max if that's more your speed, if you're looking for a little bit more power there. None of those are options with the Air. The M2 Pro is a 10-core CPU versus the 8 that I mentioned for the MacBook Air. On the GPU side, the M2 Pro starts off at a 16-core GPU, though it's configurable up to 38 cores, and the M2 chip by itself is only a 10-core GPU. So you got a 10-core GPU on the MacBook Air, and starting off with a 16-core GPU on the MacBook Pro. The MacBook Air with the M2 chip starts off at 8 gigs of unified memory, though there are options for 16 or 24 gig upgrades. On the MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro, it starts off with double the bandwidth, so going from 100 gigabits per second to 200 gigabits per second, and you start off with 16 gigs of memory, though there are options to go all the way up to 96 gigs if you're including the M2 Max chipset. Looking at storage, the 15-inch MacBook Air starts off at 256 gigs of storage with configurations up to 2 terabytes, and the 14-inch MacBook Pro starts off at 512 gigs of memory with options all the way up to 8 terabytes. How much of a difference is there between that M2 and the M2 Pro or even the M2 Max? Well, in my situation, we're going to be comparing the M2 to the M2 Pro with just some basic benchmarks. So starting off with Geekbench 6, the most recent version 6.1, which is not backward compatible with version 6, we ran Geekbench 6, and we get a 2623 for a single core for the new MacBook Air and a 10035 for the multi-core. Comparatively, the 14-inch MacBook Pro with an M2 Pro got a 2684 and a 12281. These results completely make sense. We're looking again at an 8-core versus a 10-core, but they're still based on the M2. So the single-core scores are basically identical. They're the same single cores, but there are more cores on the M2 Pro, so we're going to get a better multi-core performance benchmark. In Cinebench R23, the results got a little bit more interesting. So our single-core scores were 1646 for the MacBook Pro and 1592 for the MacBook Air. Again, basically the same on these single-core scores. What was more interesting was the multi-core scores. The MacBook Air only scored an 8351, whereas the MacBook Pro scored an 11,830. So what's going on here? Why is this multi-core score so much more higher than on the MacBook Air? And the reason is, with Cinebench, this test takes like 10, 12, 15 minutes to run, and it can take a lot of toll on the processor. So as the processor is running, it's going to be heating up, and guess what the 15-inch MacBook Air doesn't have that the 14-inch MacBook Pro does? Fans. So the MacBook Pro is able to help cool that processor and allow it to run at higher performance for an extended period of time. After a little while on the 15-inch MacBook Air, that CPU starts to take a little bit of a hit and will drop the performance to prevent the chip from overheating. So what does that give us? Well, after a really long-running benchmark, it's going to give us a higher score on the M2 Pro versus the M2 on the MacBook Air. Is that a problem? Not really for most users out there. For most people, everything's going to be a single core task, and those things are going to be completely on par with one another. Just opening apps and moving around between these two machines, I don't notice a difference at all in performance. you're just going to notice with any involved, high-intensity, multi-core tasks. Things like rendering videos and outputting videos, processing very large image files. There's all these different things that are going to be more taxing on the CPU. If you're editing code or rendering or compiling code, all that stuff is going to be using the CPU and the GPU together, especially in multi-core situations. And that's where the Pro is going to give you that better performance over the MacBook Air. Am I disappointed by these results? Not really. They're basically what I expected. The 15-inch MacBook Air is super duper thin and lacks any fans, which means it's also completely silent, which is a benefit on its own. So why did I choose these two computers to compare? I mean, there's a $700 price difference between the $1,300 MacBook Air and a $2,000 14-inch MacBook Pro. There seems to be better options. I mean, there's a even more entry-level MacBook Pro. There's also the 13-inch MacBook Air. It's a lot closer in price to the 15-inch MacBook Air. The thing is, I think these two are important to look at because you have to kind of decide, do you want the larger screen of the new MacBook Air or do you want the better performance of the 14-inch MacBook Pro? In a lot of ways, these things are just really tightly matched. I mean, if you look at the 15-inch MacBook Air, if we spec'd it out the same as the MacBook Pro, or at least as close as we can get, I went and upgraded the memory to be the same thing as the base MacBook Pro, I upgraded the storage to 512, same thing as the base MacBook Pro, and we got to $1,700. So $1,700 for the 15-inch MacBook Air versus the $2,000 MacBook Pro. So you can save $300 and get nearly the same specs. But also within that $300, you lose out on the ProMotion display, you lose out on the mini LED XDR display, you lose out on the additional ports, the ability to use more than one external display. You also lose out on the M2 Pro. That is a faster processor with a better GPU. So there's quite a few benefits for $300 to get to that MacBook Pro. I think a lot of people are going to be looking at that MacBook Air, but you're going to upgrade maybe the memory and maybe that storage, and at that price point, you're getting really close to the MacBook Pro, and that MacBook Pro makes a lot of sense for a lot of people out there. But I will say that the MacBook Air still serves a purpose, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that love this machine, maybe even more that love the 14-inch MacBook Pro. I mean, with this new MacBook Air, you are getting kind of like the best of both worlds. You're still getting great everyday performance, incredible battery life in this sleek and portable machine. I mean, it's just kind of gorgeous to look at and use. And portability as well as a large screen are going to be crucial for a lot of people out there that don't need multiple external displays, mini LED displays, an additional HDMI or SD port. Like, not everyone needs those things, and I think the Air is going to be perfect for those people. You can still add things like even more storage and get better specs on a lot of those things than the 14-inch MacBook Air for roughly the same amount of money. If you're looking at $2,000, $2,100, you can get more storage and more memory on this MacBook Air than you can on the MacBook Pro. And I think in that case, the MacBook Air makes a lot of sense. Let me know what you guys think. If you want a link on either of these, we have some deals and discounts for the new MacBook Air or the 14-inch MacBook Pro below in the description. Otherwise, let me know what your thoughts are. Do you like the new MacBook Air? Or are you sticking with the MacBook Pro? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter at Andrew_OSU. Otherwise, stay tuned. I've got a lot more videos coming your way.